webinar. My name is Monsere. I'm a faculty member in Civil Environmental Engineering, and I'm going to be co-presenting today with Professor Jennifer Dill from Marine Studies and Planning.
Oh, I was supposed to chime in there. Sorry.
So we're going to do a little tag
team.
team.
Rehearse this.
Yeah, so we didn't rehearse it. So, Nick Foster and Nathan McNeil, I don't know if Terry in here, and some of the other undergraduate students that helped in the project that are in the room. So we're going to finally get to see all of your data that you helped compile. So Nick, Nathan, and Tara obviously helped tremendously on this project. So we're going to be talking today about a project that we had funded by the NITSE to evaluate protected bike lanes in 5 U.S. cities. So the design of the evaluation wanted to look at these facilities.
Mike, is your mic on?
I said I would turn it on. Okay, so if you're on the web, we're just getting started. So our research objectives were to look at the safety, the effectiveness of the designs, the perceptions of residents nearby the facility and other road users and cyclists, and how these facilities change the behaviors of cyclists, less comfortable cyclists, if they were attracted to these facilities or not. And then we tried to look at if there was any change in economic activity around the facilities, but that's probably going to have to wait until there's a longer time period to do that evaluation. So just an overview of the facilities. So part of this is you're going to have to remember all these different facilities and the names as we kind of go through it. So I'll start up in the left is in Chicago, Illinois, and this is Dearborn. It's in the downtown urban core. It's in the loop. They took away basically a motor vehicle travel lane and added a two-way cycle track on the left side. This is on Milwaukee Avenue. It's a heavy commuter route that's on a radial out from the downtown core out to the northeast suburbs. It's a one-way protected bike lane on both sides. Has different types of buffers and protection as it goes along. Sometimes it's parking, sometimes it's flex post. But they did this basically by removing a little bit of parking and some turning lanes along the street. This is in Washington, D.C. This is L Street. It's a one-way protected bike lane on the left side of the street. They did this by removing a lane and parking. And the entire design of this is sort of a flex post separated buffer. This is Multnomah Street in Portland, a wide painted buffer, flex posts, and in a lot of places these planted strips. They did this, so this is on a one-way on both sides of the street. They did that by removing basically two travel lanes. In Austin, Texas, Rio Grande is a two-way protected facility on a one-way street. Did that by removing a travel lane and some parking. And then in Austin, this is Barton Springs, flex post protected cycle track on one side of the street. The other side of the street, most of it is next to a park, so they put a shared use path on the other side of the street. So the protected bike lane is only in one direction on Barton Springs. And in Blue Bonnet, this is in a residential area, a two-way cycle track. This is an elementary school up here. They removed a travel lane, two-way cycle track on a two-way street. And then up in San Francisco, in Oakenfell, this is two one-way couplets where it's protected bike lane in one direction on the left side and on the other direction on the right side. So on Dearborn, there were no biking facilities prior to the installation. On L Street, there were no biking facilities prior. On Milwaukee, there was existing bike lanes. On Multnomah Street, there was bike lanes. On Rio Grande, there was bike lanes. On, is it Oak or Fell, Nick, that didn't? Fell didn't have the bike lane. Fell had the bike lanes, Oak didn't. Barton Springs had bike lanes, and then Blue Bonnet, there were no bike lanes. So you can see there's quite a bit of a mix in terms of both the the type of facility, whether it's one-way or two-way, whether it's on a one-way or a two-way street, and what was changed before. So these facilities were selected as part of these cities were participating in what's called the Green Lane Project, a project by Bikes Belong, where they, the cities were getting together and collaborating on designs. And so these facilities were some of the first ones that they were able to construct. So the data we collected is sort of a two-phase type approach. We collected surveys, and we mailed surveys to residents that were within a buffer of the facility. We mailed about 10,000 surveys and had a 24% response rate. Those survey respondents had the opportunity to mail back or use an online version of the same survey, and we had about 34% of the people select the online version. We intercepted cyclists on these facilities, passed them postcards. They went to an online web survey. We had about 3,500 postcards passed out and about 1,100 surveys returned, so a 33% response rate. And then we chose primarily at intersections, but at one hotel loading zone and one transit stop facility. We videotaped these locations with cameras from two directions. We had 204 hours of video. We had AM, midday, and PM peak. And so we observed 21,000 bicyclists and 23,000 turning vehicles to sort of see how they were working at these different facilities. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, and she's going to talk about the survey demographics.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So this chart gives you some basic information about who responded to both of the surveys. On the left, the resident, and on the right, the cyclists. There's a lot up there. I'm going to just highlight a few of the differences and actually similarities. So first of all, as you might expect, our residents tend to be older, and their age distribution is more across the whole spectrum of adults, as opposed to our cyclists. Over half of them are under 35 years of age who are cycling on these facilities. So there's definitely an age difference amongst these two groups. And then the other big difference between the cyclists and the residents is on gender. So only about a third of the cyclists that we intercepted that responded to the survey were women, compared to about half of the residents. And that's pretty typical of what you see in terms of ridership in large cities. A few other things to point out. In terms of racial demographics, both samples were predominantly white. This was actually somewhat consistent with the census data for these neighborhoods. So even though Chicago and DC, for example, are far more diverse cities, and San Francisco than, for example, Portland, these particular neighborhoods are not necessarily more diverse. A few other things to note. Most of these households do not have children, definitely more so in Austin, but these other neighborhoods, if you didn't get the feeling from the photos, these were very urban environments. You know, downtown Chicago, just not far from downtown San Francisco, very urban, primarily apartments, condos, that style living, with the exception, again, of Austin. So we asked the residents some questions about sort of how they get around for work and for other purposes. And we have put people into categories based on what they said they do a lot of or most often. And we have a very diverse group here. We have people who do bike and walk a lot, or take transit, or use multiple modes, but we also have a large share of our respondents who primarily commute in a personal vehicle. And you'll see later on we sort of divide up these user groups to understand the different perspectives. So that gives you the background, sort of how we did it, a little bit about who we surveyed. Now we're going to get into some of our findings. And we're covering 5 main topics today. So did the number of people bicycling change? How well do these designs work? Because this is something that they're not used a whole lot in the U.S. There are questions about how well, particularly at intersections, these types of facilities can work. So we spent a lot of time looking at that. Do the lanes improve people's perceptions of safety? What do the residents think about the lanes, so people living nearby, and that gives us the perspective of both people who might bike in the lanes, but also people who walk on the street, people who drive on the street and use it for all sorts of other purposes. And then how attractive are the lanes for less comfortable cyclists? And the reason is one of the major motivations for cities to install these types of facilities is a belief that the increased physical separation between the bicyclists and motor vehicles is going to make for a more comfortable riding experience and potentially attract a much broader range of cyclists. So for example, get more women to cycle, because women traditionally are more averse to riding with traffic. So get those what Roger Geller has termed the interested but concerned cyclists, who are not comfortable with just a stripe of white paint separating them from the motor vehicles. So I'm going to start out with that first question. Did the number of people bicycling change? We collected data through the video on the number of people cycling on the street afterwards, and the city sometimes had counts as well. The before data came from existing counts that the city had conducted prior to the installation of the facility. When we take all of those data, this is what we've come up with in terms of sort of an overall average increase. And we've divided this between the facilities where there were striped bike lanes beforehand versus the ones where there was nothing, no bike-specific facility on the street. And you can see some very large increases in some of these cases, Rio Grande in Austin and Dearborn in Chicago, so over 100% increase in the number of cyclists on the street. The other, ranging on Milwaukee, 21% increase, and then obviously several in between. Now, one of the constraints of the evaluation that we did is that we started our evaluation right as these facilities were being constructed. So we were not able to collect a lot of good before data. We also weren't able to collect count data on parallel facilities, because one of the questions is if there's a lot more people riding on these streets than there was before. So what would cause that? Well, there's sort of three major things that would cause that. One, you're getting people to cycle when they didn't cycle before, so you're attracting new riders, which we would hope happens. You could get people who are bicycling on other streets nearby, and then they just shift their route to this street because they like the facility. Or there's people who are bicycling who start bicycling more because of the facility. So one thing these counts don't tell us is sort of what is going on, what is causing these increases in cycling. So one thing that we did do is we compared it to the number of people who commute by bicycle according to the American Community Survey for these cities, and that change over time. There are issues with using the ACS data because it's a sample and there's margins of error that make these comparisons difficult. But in just about every case, these increases were higher than the increase in overall for the city, how many workers were bicycling to work. The other thing that we did to sort of address that question is, well, what's behind these increases, is we asked the cyclists themselves what they were doing before. So we intercepted them, we asked them specifically about that trip that they were making, and asked them, before this facility was built, how would you have made this trip? And what is shown here is, first of all, in pink, the shares who said, well, I would have been riding a bike, but on a different route. So that's the route diversion. And you can see it varies a lot depending on the facility, how many said that. There's a lot of diversion, for example, in Dearborn, and less so in these other locations. The blue bar, the blue segment here is the one that really starts to capture perhaps an increase in ridership. So these are the cyclists who said that I would have used a different mode. maybe transit, maybe walking, maybe driving, but they would not have bicycled for that trip before the facility would be built. So that would be perhaps generating new cycling. Very small shares in some places say I wouldn't have taken this trip. It's sort of a new trip for me. The remainder would be, for this to add up to 100%, would be people who were cycling on that road to begin with. And in particular, if there was a bike lane there beforehand, a lot of them were using it before. One thing, a big sort of remaining question about doing this type of analysis is these surveys were conducted shortly after the facilities were built. And one remaining question is sort of how long does it take when you build a new facility like this that's a lot different than what was there before? How long does it take to get those new riders, people to really change their behavior from, to start bicycling when they didn't before? We don't have evidence of that from this research. I suspect it takes a bit longer than the time period we had for this evaluation. I'm going to turn it back over to Chris, who's going to talk about how well the designs work.
And I remembered to turn my mic back on. So we looked at the design elements. We looked at primarily at intersections, and you're going to see some slides here on what we are calling sort of, or what are called sort of the mixing zones. And we also looked at signalized intersections. We had a little bit of video at one hotel loading zone in DC, and we did a little bit of survey work on a loading zone in Multnomah and a transit stop, but not much there yet. Providing curb access is definitely a design challenge for these protected facilities because you've basically protected the curb, and so transit vehicles or delivery vehicles or other things need access to the curb, and so how you do that is an important design question. And it's something we weren't able to completely answer. Well, we weren't able to answer much in this research. And then a few other things that we gathered in the survey that I'm not going to show you anything today on. And then we did also, so on the segment level, I'll show you in the safety section that follows this design piece a little bit of difference about the preferences for the different types of buffers that we looked at. But primarily the design questions are at the intersection, and then are at the intersections. Then if you have to provide access across the protected facility for like a minor driveway or for curb access in that area. So we focused heavily on the intersection piece. So here's the second part of your quiz is to remember sort of all these terminologies, and it's been but I'm going to help you because you're going to have these pictures throughout the rest. So the cities have approached, so the protected bikeway, you saw those pictures with the different the different buffers, they're curb tight, and as they approach an intersection where you have vehicles turning over it, the cities have approached how they do those designs a little bit differently, as you can see on these slides. The one design I'll show you after we go over these is in Chicago, where they used traffic signals to completely separate it. But these mixing zones basically require, so this is on Multnomah, the right turning vehicle has to enter this zone, and the bikes are coming up from here. So the mixing is sort of in this area where it's a shared space between bikes and cars. And so it's definitely the challenge on protected facilities because you've provided this great protection and separation from traffic, but when you get to intersections, now you have to sort of mix with traffic. So so the way these are done has different, has implications on how safe the entire league feels. So in Multnomah, I'm sort of calling this the NACTO-style yield shark tooth mixing zone. It's probably too long, but for now, anyways, and notice here, these are from our surveys of bicyclists. We asked in the surveys, if you're turning right or if you're going through, which position you should be in. So that's what those colored letters are. In DC, they keep the flex post all the way up, and you can't see it, but the flex posts keep going here. There's a short mixing zone where the bikes have to move over into this, what we're calling an advisory bike lane, and the cars move over here. So the mixing and the yielding and interactions in a very short space. In San Francisco, they sort of use that same approach where they use this advisory bike lane. This is on Fell, so these vehicles are making a left turn, and this is on Oak, the vehicles are making a right turn. but basically the vehicles, the bikes are in this advisory bike lane, and the vehicles merge over them to get into this space to make the right turn. And you can see from these pictures that that right turn space is pretty narrow. This intersection we didn't take any video at because this is, I guess, in San Francisco bike lore, a fairly famous intersection because of this Arco gas station that has the cheapest gases prices in town, and so people line up forever. So we sort of had to avoid this intersection. Then San Francisco used two other designs where they basically just made this whole lane a shared space and used a sharo marking. And then here they put this same sort of advisory bike lane, but a green skip zone across the whole left turning lane. So those are basically the 5 types of designs that we looked at. And just to give you a sense between the total number of things that of cyclists and turning cars that we observed is sort of plotted on this. It's over the 6 hours, and you can see that the Chicago intersections were definitely the busiest. So that these are on the Dearborn Street, and these are on Milwaukee. 400 or so bikes per hour. Lots of bike activity. The Multnomah one is fairly low bike volumes. These are the green bars are the bike volumes, and then in San Francisco, a little bit higher bike volumes, and then in DC, sort of in between bike volumes. So you notice that Austin isn't on here. We didn't do any video collection in Austin because there wasn't any of these sort of design variations in Austin. We did all the surveys in Austin, but no video collection in Austin. So here's this. This is what I've tried to get to. This is a super busy table, so let me explain it to you. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to pull out these different things from the survey, from the video, and the survey and the video. And these different sort of columns are sort of different types of questions related to either perceptions of the cyclist or residents in the survey, or correctly identifying, like that question that showed where in this picture here, if you're a through cyclist, which lane should you be in, lane A, B, or C? So it sort of tabulates the correct responses to those. And then the video one, we sort of matched up those same sort of responses. When we watched the video, we said we tried to find if the cyclist, where was their path through the intersection, where was the vehicle's path, etc. So here's the little pictures to help you remind you which one they are, and here's the long cryptic name and the intersection. But what I've done in each column is tried to sort of highlight in dark purple sort of the best response or the best answer for there, and then the middle blue is sort of the next one, and then the lightest blue is sort of the third best in that particular column. So let's look at the first column. So we asked cyclists on all these different approaches, how do the markings, do you understand how to go through the intersections based on the design? So, and it's a little nuanced, but I had to go all the way to the strongly agree category to get any kind of difference. Because if you look at the total agreement, it's almost 98%. So all of the designs, there's not really much difference when you look at total agreement, but when you look at strongly agreement, and I'm sort of reaching to sort of get some differences, you do see that the DC so the ones with these advisory bike lanes, so the green marking, sort of marking the path, have a little bit higher response rate. I'm not sure it's that significant. So sort of on the comprehension column, when we asked this question, we did a little bit of learning. DC was our first survey, and we didn't ask these sort of lane positioning questions in the DC survey. But we did in Portland. We asked this for the cyclist, and in San Francisco, these questions were all for residents. So it's a little bit of the Portland column is what the cyclists think either drivers or they should do. And then in the San Francisco one, it's residents who sometimes biked and who sometimes drove. So one thing to highlight is in this Portland design, where should through bikes be, is that about I think it was about 25 or 30% of the cyclists thought they should move over into that little slice between the through lane and the right turning lane. And we also sort of observed that same thing on the video. So I know, not all of the designs have that little buffer there, but it does sort of look like a bike lane, and we did observe people stating that they thought they should go there, and we did observe in the video that they did that. In terms of the bicycle turning right, where should the bike be? That was a fairly easy one, especially on these, on the bike ones, they were pretty consistent. And then on the turning motorist, it's when you show these things on a survey and it's got this giant arrow, turning left, if you don't get 98% response, then so it's better to sort of look at the video piece. And sort of two things to highlight from the video for the turning motorist is these two designs down here in San Francisco with the green skip all the way across and the Sharrow marking had sort of only about half of the vehicles sort of positioning themselves in that lane to make the turn. So most of the vehicles were making the turn from the lane adjacent to this. So they weren't using the mixing zone. And if you kind of go back through the table, not that you have time, but you see also, we also sort of see that the cyclist in this last column sort of agreeing that they feel safe, which on these two designs, this one had the highest percent of cyclists saying agreeing that they feel safe. It has a little bit to do that there's no vehicles in that lane, so because the motorists aren't using it. And then then the other one in this through bicyclist one, so on this one here we measured, so did they go over the Sharrow? So the Sharrow was sort of delimiting their path. And what we found in the video is that especially when there were cars present, the cyclists didn't move over and take the whole lane. They stayed closer to curb. They stayed closer to curb tight. So then the last thing that we did is we observed and tried to quantify all of the sort of interactions between bikes and cars and categorize them in conflicts. We saw no in all of our 20 or 40,000 in things that we watched. We saw no sort of emergency conflict. So we had most of the conflicts that we sort of labeled as very, very minor sort of interactions, and we had hardly any sort of medium level conflicts. But I did go and calculate this conflict rate between the number of conflicts we observed and it divided by the product of the right turning vehicles and the through vehicles to sort of normalize that for rate. I'm not sure I have much confidence in drawing any conclusions from this, but I've done some other analysis of it, and it looks sort of consistent from what we've done on other things, is that these interactions and conflicts is just a function of the number of through bikes and the number of right turning vehicles. So those two things, the more you get of one or the other, the more likely you are to get any conflicts. And there's not, there's not enough variation yet here to sort of tease out which of these designs is better in that sense. So that was a long table. So in Chicago, they took a different approach, is that they, on this two-way, because it's a two-way facility on a one-way street, and you can see this is downtown in the loop, is they separated all the movements. So basically, nobody can go, there can't be any legal conflicts at these intersections. So somebody has to be either running a red light or running a ped signal or running the bike signal in order for two things to interact. So you can see, so this is a one-way street. At all these intersecting one-way streets, is they have left turns that separate out the vehicle movements. So the vehicles cannot turn. They get a red arrow. You can see the two green balls for the through movements and the green signal for the bike, and the other one is up here on the mast arm. So everybody's separated in time for the movements. So, and this is basically along the whole length of Dearborn. Every intersection has these bike signals. So just a quick sum from the surveys on Dearborn. We asked a little question about putting the bike signal, the little symbol in the lens, is that a good way to communicate that that's a signal for bike? And we had 87% of the residents that responded to that agree. 74% said they like that bikes and turning cars each have their own signals. And then this one here, we had only 66% agreement on, it's clear to me which signal I should use as a motorist. So if you go back to this picture, I mean, it is busy. And we can't tell from that survey question really sort of what is the confusion with this vehicle seeing this green ball and thinking they can make the turn, or confusing it with the bike signal sort of opaquing to sort of a green ball. But there was there was not as much agreement on that one question as we'd like. So here's just, we wanted to look at sort of what's the overall level of compliance. And the top graph is people on bikes, and the bottom graph is people in motor vehicles or drivers. So these are, so the big blue bars are the people that did the legal movement, and then the gray bars are sort of the preceded illegally on red. And they're not quite the same denominator. So the bikes is basically everybody that stopped, and the motor vehicle one is every vehicle that turned left. But because of the way the signals are, Nick and I were trying to flush this out. If you can compare the 6% compliance to the 6% if the non-compliance between the two are comparable, and it's not quite perfect, but it does give you a sense that the overall sort of compliance is pretty high, and that this bears out when we look at the conflict video, that there are some vehicles that turn left when they're not supposed to, and there are bikes that go through the signal when they're not supposed to, and there are PEDs that go through across when they're not supposed to. So, but this jumped into the crosswalk was sort of a category that we moved, where you saw a vehicle like sort of leave the stop bar and start to make the turn and then stop. So they either recognized that there was PEDs in the crosswalk, or they were being aggressive, but we can't really get inside the driver's mind from the video, but it does sort of maybe line up a little bit with sort of this piece here, and that probably will go down after time. I mean, we were maybe five months after these bike signals were installed, pretty new sort of control on Dearborn. So the next thing is we wanted to look at how did it improve the user's perception of safety, and so the green bars, we sort of divided it up by we asked the question is, did it make the street safer for walking, for driving, and for bicycling? And so the green bars are the bicycling one. These are in the different cities. These are % of residents saying that safety increased. And since these facilities are really meant to increase, were really just for bicycling, that's pretty strong sort of agreement in what you'd expect. But you even saw some positive agreement for the different facilities for walking and driving, even though these they make the street, they sort of organize the street. And so there is some positive benefits, particularly for the pedestrians. In fact, we had, there's some anecdotal feedback we've gotten, like on Multnomah, where you used to have to cross, 4 lanes plus the center turn lane. Now it's just 1 lane in each direction with the center turn lane. The yielding for the pedestrians to get across there is much higher because there's only 1 lane and it's easier to get across. So they had some positive feedback. So there was, perceptions of improved safety for bicycling, but even for some of the other modes. This is probably one of the strongest conclusions we had across all the facilities, across all the cities. 96% of the cyclists felt that this protected facility made cycling safer for them. So, and it's pretty, and this is, a survey of about 1,000 cyclists. So this is probably the most consistent evidence we had on the safety component. We also explored a little bit about buffers, because the buffer designs sort of vary from cities to cities. So sometimes it's a flex post in this painted space, and sometimes it's the painted space, the flex post, and parked cars. And then in Multnomah, we have in Portland, we've got the planters. So different kinds of buffers. So we asked on the survey to sort of score from 1 to 4 how safe these different buffers make you feel. And I've left the city names off this graph to sort of remove a little bit of confusion, but these were on the facility itself. So on that particular facility, we asked, if they were on Multnomah, we asked them how well the planters on the one-way make them feel. So the blue bars here are the two-way streets, and the green are the one-way streets, and I've ordered them from sort of lowest to highest. So just the sections that just had paint sort of had the lowest mean score, and then sort of a increasing component as we go up. And then down here in Austin, this is the Austin facility where they were on the separated path. So you would expect that that one would have the highest sort of comfort score rated. But then in here, there's a little bit of mixing between flex posts, parked cars, one-way, two-way. And so we looked at just this, that mean comfort scores on the y-axis, total width. And this total width, we said sort of curb face to the motor vehicle travel lane. Just what's that total width? So if it's a two-way facility, and you're on that two-way facility and there's no other bikes coming, you sort of get that whole space. So we just wanted to look, because when I looked at this chart, it seemed to be more than just the buffer type that was going on. And so here, looking at sort of width. And the y-axis is completely exaggerated. These are tenth increments. But just to show that there is a little bit relationship between the total width that's provided as the total space for cycling and the comfort score seems to be some positive relationship. And out here, here's that outlier where that shared use path is only about 8 feet off the curb face, but gets that comfort score up above. Then we sort of asked, in a hypothetical sense, which of these different buffers, how would you feel most comfortable on a 1 to 6 scale? And it ordered sort of what you, it ordered in an intuitive way. So this green bar is sort of the cyclist responding that this makes me very comfortable. So this large green bar, and they're ordered in from mean score from highest to lowest. So the highest scoring one was the planters with the separated bikeway, then the buffers with flex post, then the raised curb, then the parked cars with the painted buffer. One of the things this might be because even though we tried to make really hard in this picture that's a guy leaning up against a car, so it's clearly not in motion, it still could have been interpreted as, Anwood says painted car with parked cars, that there is a little bit that we can't really replicate sort of moving traffic in these pictures. And then the two ones with paint. So it came out ordered in sort of a preference state, which you would expect. And then if you went one more down, we also asked some questions about the different types of facilities you're sort of comfortable on. If you went to a striped bike lane, it looked less than no buffer at all. So everything's sort of ordered logically in sort of in preference comfort. So I'll turn it back to Jennifer to talk about.
Okay. So what do the residents think about the lanes? We asked a lot of questions. I'm just going to give you a few of the highlights that I think are important. And the first is just general support for this concept of protected lanes. There were at least 3 questions on our survey that got at this. The purple bars here on the top of each grouping is that facilities that encourage bicycling for transportation are a good way to improve public health. So just sort of a broad support, particularly for health. The green is I would support building more protected bike lanes at other locations. And then the blue, sort of more focused, because of the protected bike lanes, the desirability of living in my neighborhood has increased. What we can take from these is, first of all, if we look sort of across the board on the purple and green, is that the support generally for bicycle facilities, and particularly more protected lanes, is really strong across sort of all residents with respect, and I say all, this is broken up by sort of what modes of transportation they use. And so in particular, on the top, 75% of all of our residents thought that they would support building more protected bike lanes throughout the city. And then if you even look at people who primarily drive to work, still 69% of them. Okay, so obviously our bicyclists down here, 95% of them thought they should. But still, that's strong support, sort of no matter what mode people primarily use. And then I put in this question here about the desirability of living in my neighborhood has increased, because I mean, that's a pretty significant thing, that this one facility could make the desirability of your neighborhood improve. And overall, 43% said that, and even 39% of the people who primarily drive said that it improved their neighborhood. About an equal share said it didn't really do anything, and less than 15% said that it had a negative effect. So, you know, overall support for these types of facilities, I would say, is really strong from all types of residents. Chris had already mentioned some of the potential benefits to pedestrians, and we had a couple questions of the residents that we asked. So the satisfaction with the walking environment on this street, has it increased, decreased, or no change? And you can see that, you know, it obviously varies across the cities and the facilities, but in a lot of cases there's a, you know, a decent share of the residents thought that it actually also improved the walking environment. And so, for example, over a third in Multnomah. And then also my sense of safety when crossing the street has improved. You can see, you know, in a lot of cases, about a third of the residents felt safer when crossing the street. And so, for example, in Multnomah, again, we've heard that anecdotally from people who use the street a lot. Now, when you build these facilities, and particularly when you take away a lane of traffic or you take away some parking, there could be some negative effects on people who drive and or park on the street. So we did ask about that. And so these are the responses to the question, you know, since the protected bike lanes were built, the amount of time it takes me to drive on the street has, you know, increased, decreased, or stayed the same. We're showing, you know, the share who said the amount of time has increased. So they think that there's more congestion, it's taking longer. And you can see it really varies between about a quarter or even less to, in the cases of Chicago, more than half of the people who drive on that street thought that it was taking them longer. And some of this makes sense because there are, you know, they did change the lane configurations. There's more limitations for turning movements off the street. So some of these perceptions do make sense. On the other hand, we also asked, since the protected bike lanes were built, how safe and predictable bicyclists are acting has increased. And those are the blue bars here. And in a lot of the cases, you can see, actually, it's pretty consistent that about half of the motorists are saying that the bicyclists are more predictable. And we have other questions on there, you know, saying that I like the fact that bikes and cars are separated, and there's overwhelming sort of response for that from people who drive on these streets. They like the separation. So while that might take longer, there's other benefits to the people who are driving on the street. And then parking. We asked a couple questions about parking, both my ability to find a parking spot on the street, has it had a negative or positive impact, and how stressful it is to park on the street. So the blue bars here, and the ones where I've shown you the numbers, are the share of the residents who said that the lane has had a negative impact on their ability to find parking on that street. And you can see it ranges from about half down to about 30%. But the other thing to note here is we've put sort of the change in the number of parking spaces. In a few cases, we don't have the exact number yet. We're hoping to fill that in. The point here is that when you go, for example, down to Multnomah, where they actually added some parking as a result, still 30% of the people said that it's harder to find a parking space. The point being is that sometimes people's perceptions of impacts don't correspond directly with the reality of the change being made. And parking is often a contentious issue with implementing these types of facilities. I'm going to speed it up a little bit. Our last question had to do with the attractiveness of the lanes for less comfortable cyclists. We divided our residents into the 4 types of cyclists developed by Roger Geller: the strong and fearless, enthused and confident, interested but concerned, and the no way, no how. That was sort of the distribution that we got. And then we just asked them a general question: I would be more likely to ride a bicycle if motor vehicles and bicycles were physically separated by a barrier. And 85% of the interested but concerned agreed with that statement. So it shows support amongst that group for this idea. And then residents, if we keep them in those groups and we ask, about the safety of the different modes, so both the interested but concerned and enthused and confident, nearly all of them said that the bike lanes, the protected lanes, made safety for bicycling improve on that street. And then looking at the responses from the cyclists that we intercepted, earlier on I showed you, how would you have made this trip otherwise? We also asked them to agree or to tell us, because of the separated bikeway, how often I ride a bicycle overall has increased or decreased somewhat or a lot. And these are showing the gender differences. And if we just focus in on the overall, which is all the facilities combined, what we found is that there's a significantly higher share of women saying that the protected bikeway has caused them to increase their overall amount of cycling. There's obviously some variations amongst the different cities, but overall that was a big increase, so that's a good sign. So I'm going to try to summarize. We've presented you, I know, with a lot of findings. There's even more that will be in the final report that we're working on. But a few key things. We definitely found increases in the volumes, the number of people bicycling on these streets, with some evidence that some of that is new bicycling, that it's not just diverted from other routes. At least at this time, a small share, but still a share of that is new. Definitely strong improvements in terms of perceived safety on these facilities, for the people riding on the facilities, and I would also say people who use the roads using other modes. That's the generally positive perception of other road users, and really strong support for this concept sort of across the board from residents in these neighborhoods. The design choices, whether it be the buffer type or the mixing zone and sort of how those are designed, do make some sort of marginal differences in perceived safety and comfort and perhaps some of the interactions. There's definitely going to be more to come. We're working on our report. You can sort of get the sense that this was a huge amount of data. We've shared some key slices of it with you today. The other point I should make on the safety issue is that we've only collected data within about a year of when these facilities were built, and it will take several years to get adequate crash data to find out if there's a differences in crash rates over time for these facilities. With that, we're going to take some questions. I want to thank all the students who helped look at those thousands and thousands of cyclists and motorists going through all those intersections, and our partners at all of the cities. So, lots of hands going up, and I'm going to, Chris, turn your microphone back on. I'm just going to start in this front row, and we'll try to get as many as possible. And then, yeah.
So did congestion or like automobile speed, did that change? Did it go up or down?
Yeah, but we didn't study that explicitly, but yeah, so we didn't include that as part because we didn't have any. So once we didn't have any before observations when the facilities were in. I know that Portland has done its own evaluation on Multnomah, and I think the travel time's actually gone a little bit better. So I think it's really facility specific, and we decided not to really focus on that because that's a question you can sort of evaluate, as in an engineering sense with some simulation models and analysis. So we didn't really touch on that.
Can I get just one quick question?
Sure.
Will there ever be like a standard bicycle mixing zone design?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you see in the variations of those is that means that people are are trying different designs. So a lot of it has to do with how much space they have, and then where, if it's a left or right, and just different approaches to the design. So I think that, there's this project, and there's a FHWA has a project underway, and then there's the AASHTO bike guide is proposed to be rewritten. So I think down the line there will be some standard approaches, more standardized.
Okay, and then I guess I'll remind you, if you're a student in the class, you're supposed to say your name. I'm going to go here, and then I'll get back over here.
Dirk Kinsey. How similar were the neighborhoods in terms of demographics?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we have a detail table on that. In general, I would say that the Austin neighborhoods were a bit different in that you had more families. There's more single-family detached homes there. The other neighborhoods, not huge differences. These were also urban, big city neighborhoods. I mean, Multnomah isn't quite as obviously as urban as downtown Chicago, but not huge.
Yeah, I think
that playing a role in neighborhood perceptions about the projects?
It can. We have looked at some of the perceptions by neighborhood, and it's still pretty strong. Yes, there are some variations, but we never find a case where it's like, oh, they don't like it. So it's not as if they don't like it in one city and that's being masked by the other 5 cities.
Yeah, and I think one anomaly was that the Multnomah neighborhood had a lot of there's a lot of senior housing there.
Yeah.
So that neighborhood, that survey had a higher share of older residents than the other ones.
Yeah. Okay, let's try this.
So a related question, Nate Rochester. Wondering if you guys saw any significant demographic trends among individuals who reported negative perception of the bike lane changes.
We have looked at gender and age with respect to perspectives, and we're not finding many differences on sort of the general support for these ideas. So far what we've looked at, not much.
Yeah.
You just
Well,
the non-commuters.
Yeah, I mean, that's the chart that I did show you, is that, the cyclists are definitely the most supportive of these facilities. But the people who drive, and I'll be honest, I haven't checked whether that's a statistically significant difference between drivers, but it's a big share.
Yeah, and I think, when we typed the people into the 4 categories, the residents, sort of the no way, no how, when you look at some of their perceptions, they're generally more negative about these facilities than the people that would or are riding. So.
Okay, here.
Yeah, Alexander Napton. You probably already answered this, but how many people did you typically interview for each survey?
In each city?
No, just in general, like an average, for each survey, like 20, 30, 100.
So each resident survey was about 1,000 mail out, and each intercept. So we got about 1,000.
About 1,100 cyclists.
Yeah, so about 400 cyclists on each facility. Although the Austin facilities, we probably should have mentioned that the Austin cyclist intercepts were relatively low, so they were below 50. But all the other facilities were, 100, 200, and then the residents ones were
600 to 800 residents per city.
Yeah, actually, we could just answer there.
Go here, the gentleman with the pink tie.
Gregory Kirkland. Basically, kind of going off of Daniel Stye's question, when approaching one of these intersections, is there any kind of consistency in how they're trying to standardize the signaling so it's less confusing to either the bikes or the vehicular movements?
Yeah, so only the Dearborn facility was the only one that had signals. There were 2 other places that had signals in San Francisco and in Austin, and another location in Chicago. But we weren't really focused on the display of the bike signal specifically. So, but I think that's in proposed rulemaking. So there will be the ability to use the bike signals in the MUTCD relatively soon.
Okay, the ladies next to you.
The wording of questions can influence a survey's outcome. when you asked people how they felt about these facilities, did you use the term separated bike lanes or protected bike, protected bike lanes, which could be considered a loaded term?
So we did not use protected. So first of all, in the resident surveys, we also provided a picture of the facility in their neighborhood. So we were trying to give them the context, that one that's just a block or two away. It did vary depending on what terminology the city was using. But I think that off the top of my head, I can't remember which terms we used where.
We used cycle track, separated.
We actually did not use the word protected in the survey.
So.
Yeah, I do. That's a term we're using more now. Okay, I'm gonna let's see. Todd.
I was just wondering, with your selection of cities, I know that the cities that you looked at were some of the original Green Lane projects, Green Lane cities. I think Memphis was also part of that, and I was just wondering why it wasn't considered.
It was supposed to be included, but their construction was delayed, and so we basically missed it. I wish we could have done it because it is a very different city, but their project got too delayed to include it in the evaluation.
We did go on Jennifer did go on a field visit.
I did visit it. Okay.
My first name is Alicia, last name Holloway, and my question is, I know that you said that you had kind of looked at conflicts in the mixing zones, and that you don't have all the data yet on crashes, but have you seen any trends yet that there's more accidents, or has there been more accidents in those areas in comparison to the other areas, or other areas that have been biking but not designated those biking zones?
Yeah, I mean, so the approach was to compare the performance across those different mixing zone designs, not that mixing zone design to some other type of design, like not on a protected, like a bike lane or no bike lane. So, I mean, you saw that chart where sort of all the results were kind of all over there was not any consistent winner. I've come up with a couple scoring matrices trying to figure out which one is but I think the one trend is, it seems to be, one thing I've been thinking about is that the use of the green markings through it tends to do a better job of guiding the cyclist path through the intersection. And that's, the strongest trend I saw was the relationship between the number of turning bikes and the number of turning cars and through bikes, and it sort of drowns out any of the differences in the designs.
So you didn't see any crashes?
We did not see a single crash on the video.
You don't have any data on accidents, but did you see that there was more conflict in the mixing zones versus the other areas?
We didn't do that comparison.
Okay.
But I mean, that's on a separated facility, unless there's a break, that's the only place you can have a conflict. So in the mid-block pieces, it should take care of all interactions except for, pedestrians crossing or driveway breaks.
Okay, you've had your hand up patiently for a while.
Did you do any analysis of whether cars or bikes were more often to blame for the conflicts?
I'm looking at Nick. We didn't assign blame.
It's hard. I mean, just anecdotally, watching the video, particularly in Chicago, there's a lot of the conflict, at least one of the people involved was doing something illegal, making a turn against a red light or walking across the street against the pedestrian signal. And there's just a lot of, but it's all very sort of slow too. I mean, in these urban environments, it's a relatively slow traffic, which would be one reason we're not, that you see conflict and not crash. Okay, I think this is going to be our last in-person question that'll be on the air, and then we'll be up here for a few minutes afterwards.
So it seemed like the rate of conflict was fairly low across all the different designs, and but the rate of compliance with the correct usage was not so great. Given that many states in the U.S. don't have a requirement to complete a new driver's test when you renew your license. So there's no real requirement for education on these new designs. Would you recommend that different communities continue to pursue their own local solutions to this design, or that some National Transportation Safety Board would get involved and try to standardize it as soon as possible so that there's only one kind of thing that people need to learn?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there'll be just one thing, but there should be a set of, a set of sort of recommended design tools, and I think that's coming relatively shortly. So I think that's what I think the US DOT through FHWA and AASHTO and NACTO sort of, I mean, it's not like there isn't any guidance. I mean, the NACTO guide does have some guidance. It's just that depending on the situation, the cities have tried slightly different designs. So I think the longer answer to your question is that yes, there'll be some guidance soon. So, but yeah, I wouldn't yeah. Yeah, I mean,
to try to figure out which one is exactly the best.
Yeah, I mean, I think innovation is good, and so I mean, I think little tweaks on these and then evaluating them is a good approach. So.
All right.
Professor.
Before we thank Professors Monsere and Dill for their terrific presentation, just a reminder: next week, Steve Perrone from the PTV Group. Analytical efficiencies through integration of modeling and simulation. So we'll see you then, and let's thank our speakers.